Welcome to All Villa, No Filler. Remember to subscribe to the show, follow us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Aston Villa have been extremely active in the transfer market already this summer. Highlights include Chelsea left-back Ian Maatsen being due to sign for 37 million quid, while Luiz is joining Juventus with players coming the other way. To talk about that, I'm joined by Dougie Critchley. He's a broadcaster with Football Daily and Sky Sports. Dougie, it's great to speak to you again.
Thanks for having me on, Frankie. Looking forward to this. Yeah, as you say, I think more so than probably any other Premier League club, Villa have probably generated the most headlines. There's been a lot going on, so looking forward to getting stuck into it with you today.
Yeah, and talking of getting stuck in, we've signed a left back in Ian Maatsen, a player who does like to get stuck in. How big a signing is he for Aston Villa?
I think he's potentially pretty huge. I mean, you look at the age and particularly the wages of Luca Dean and Alex Moreno, and it felt like Villa needed to make a change there at some stage in the future. I think most Villa fans that I've spoken to probably would have expected a right back to come in first. If Konza is going to move back into the central areas, if Matty Cash is potentially upgradable. But I do think Ian Maatsen's a really astute signing. Look, he was shining for a Champions League club last year on the run to a Champions League final. Yes, he made a mistake in the final, but that is kind of inevitable with a 22-year-old. And I think he's got a massive future. Chelsea fans, I think if they didn't have to make so much positivity around their club and their transfer dealings and try and make sense of their extraordinary strategy, would probably reflect on this as a big loss. You know, Marc Cucurella did pick up towards the end of the season, but I think Chelsea have potentially sold their best left back on the evidence of last year. So I think it's a bit of a coup for Villa.
Yeah, it does feel like it. It feels like a level above what we've usually been able to sign. I think it feels like a bit of a statement signing. How versatile is he? Because, from what I've watched of him and read about him, he's not just a left back who can sort of, attack very well, but he can also invert, which is something Villa haven't done with fullbacks. So, just how versatile is he?
Yeah, I think very. I think Pochettino last year was making some interesting decisions with his left backs at the start of the season, in particular with Colwill being chosen over Matson. Matson was featuring even up front at different points. I think he even featured on the right wing. So it didn't feel like Pochettino backed him as his left back, which I was personally quite surprised about, especially with the form and sort of mistake proneness, let's say, of Disasi and Badiashile last year. Colwill probably was the player to really base your defence around, or the centre of your defence around. Matson probably should have got some minutes, but I liked the fact that he took the initiative, he went to Dortmund and sort of rebuilt his reputation and ended up with 2 goals and 2 assists in the league. He also scored against Atletico Madrid in their Champions League quarter-final and just generally proved himself to be of that level. And if he's good enough for Borussia Dortmund, and, they didn't have the best season domestically, but if he's good enough for a side that can get to a Champions League final, I think he's definitely good enough to start for Chelsea that are still in transition. And I think he could potentially be an upgrade in the next couple of years for Villa too. It feels like he's got quite a nice sort of well-rounded game, I should say. Big defensive output, reads the game exceptionally well, good energy, not the tallest, not the most physical. But I don't think that's a natural, a real disaster given the fact Luca Dean and Alex Moreno are relatively vertically challenged, let's say, as well. So I'm excited for the signing. And if it means that Alex Moreno can head back to Spain, there's been reports that he's been a bit homesick, and you can base your future around Luca Dean and his delivery from wide and Ian Maatsen and his delivery and energy on that left flank, then I think Villa are in a pretty good position.
Yeah, you say homesick for Moreno. I have been to Sevilla, which is where he's from, or Betis, and I'd be homesick for there as well. Beautiful city, I must say. Another big move that's happened: Douglas Luiz to Juventus, or is going through, as we say. It looks like Samuel Iling-Junior and Enzo Barrenechea are coming the other way to Aston Villa from Juve. What do you make of that whole deal?
I don't think it's ideal, if I'm totally honest. I think it's a big loss to Aston Villa. Look, I think most Villa fans, I'm sure maybe you agree, Frankie, maybe saw that Douglas Luiz wasn't as consistent as he was in the first half of the year. In the second half of last season, definitely wasn't at his best from sort of August to December, or compared to that period, he wasn't at his best. He really did shine at the start of the year when he had that base from Boubacar Kamara as well behind him. He was scoring goals, he was creating goals, he's getting himself around the pitch. So I think he is an absence, a big loss. And Ross Barkley has a lot of skills. I think he was brilliant on the ball for Luton last year. It was only a few months ago, I think around sort of Christmas time, January time, when Luton had that little sort of purple patch of form that people were saying Ross Barkley should go to the Euros. As it turns out, I don't think he was quite at that level, but that does go to show how well he played for Luton. My issue with Ross Barkley is, for all his quality on the ball, he's quite weak defensively. Last year, only completed about 28% of his tackles. For context, for a central midfielder, you'd hope it would be about 55%. It was actually in the top 10 lowest ratios in Europe, the second worst out of any Premier League player behind Nicholas Jackson, who is playing a role at Chelsea, or at least was under Pochettino, where he was harassing players, harrying players, and so pressing really high. And so players would often go past him, hence the low tackle success rate. But for Ross Barkley, who was playing centrally for Luton, to be run past by so many attackers does suggest that he's not really going to provide the sort of defensive sort of abilities that Douglas Luiz did. Now, it looks like Barrenechea is going to be brought in to try and do that. He's not the most experienced player, but if it's going to be Camara, Barkley, Tielemans, maybe John McGinn rotating in there, it does have a reasonable balance to it. But I just do slightly worry that you've left yourself a little bit short if you need someone who's A, experienced and B, got a little bit more defensive security about them.
Yeah, sure. He's a major loss, Douglas Luiz. There's no doubt about it. And you're right. He did lose a bit of consistency, particularly when Kamara got injured in sort of late January, early February. And I think he'll be a big addition to Juventus. But, Samuel Iling-Junior, that's a player who's really caught my eye. He's from London originally, very near to where I live, actually, in Stoke Newington. So what are your thoughts on Iling-Junior? He's very, very young. Do you think he can come in and contribute to Aston Villa?
Yeah, I would have thought so. I would have thought so. Yeah, came through at the Chelsea's academy, I believe. Then went to Juventus. That's a sign of his maturity. The fact that he backed himself. Juve had loads of really talented youngsters coming through at a similar time. Sule, who went on loan last season. Fadjo Ali, who had that betting ban. Kino Yildiz as well, who's shone on occasion for Turkey in this Euros as well. So it was really competitive. They also had Filip Kostic, who was more naturally suited to Max Allegri's 3-4-3 or 3-5-2 that he was playing a lot last season. Filip Kostic is in his 30s. He's had a great stint at Eintracht Frankfurt. So I don't think it's, any slight on Iling-Junior that he struggled to sort of displace him as a wing back in particular, because Iling-Junior is a more natural forward. But I'm excited to see what he can do in the Premier League. You look at Zaniolo having some injury issues last year, having the odd good game, a little bit inconsistent as well. Hopefully if you build around Iling-Junior and back him, then I don't think it's a bad option. The issue is that, yes, you've got some players for Douglas Luiz, but I'd have probably just preferred the cash and then use that cash to effectively strengthen at right back to maybe sign that, higher experience level of defensive midfielder to rival Camara and to back up Camara if needed. It feels like maybe you've got two players that are project players for a player that was a guaranteed starter in your starting 11. So you might see a small drop off in Villa's performances next year, although we'll see. There's still months of the transfer window to go. You've made some interesting moves so far, and I'm sure they won't be the last to come in.
Yeah, it's interesting, Iling-Junior. You see him on the left for Juventus, and when I look at the left-hand side, suddenly for Villa, I look at Pau Torres, obviously left centre back. Mings coming back from injury. You got Matson coming in, hopefully. Morgan Rogers, Emi Buendia, Jacob Ramsey. Suddenly, that left-hand side for Aston Villa looks very, very strong all of a sudden. Does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you reel off the options there's a lot of players that have either performed very well for Villa last season, like Morgan Rogers coming in January, or performed well for Villa in the past. Also, Pau Torres last season I thought was sensational. It'll be interesting to see what sort of form Tyrone Mings comes back in. And then you're also looking on the right-hand side, and you've got two top players, I think, in Moussa Diaby and Leon Bailey. And I'm expecting a little bit more from Moussa Diaby, next season. I think he, in a similar way to Dominic Szoboszlai, maybe just the sort of relentless nature of the Premier League and English football, and the amount of the intensity of every game, the intensity of every minute of every game, slightly different to the Bundesliga perhaps. And I think both him and Szoboszlai faded towards the end of the season. Having said that, Leon Bailey, it seemed to push him on to new levels as well. So I think your right-hand side, I think both flanks are looking pretty strong now. And I wouldn't be surprised if you were looking at a right back in the next few weeks as well.
Yeah, and do you know much about Barrenechea at all? Really, I know he was at Frosinone last season in Italy. I know they got relegated, but he started played every game, or almost every game, and he, very much impressed with the Italian journalists I've spoken to. I mean, do you think he, as I say, is he a bit of a project player more so than a starter coming in?
Yeah, I think he'll be a backup to Camera, but a player with a sort of high reputation, going out on loan, that's probably the right option for someone at his stage of his development. I can't say I watch Frosinone on a week in, week out basis, but the way Serie A people that I follow on Twitter are talking about him, that was a player that had high potential. He's clearly someone that Emery wanted at the club because they could have just asked for pure cash from Juve. I know Juve are a little bit cash strapped. I know Villa want to sort things out with their PSR issues as well. But to try and get Iling-Junior and two highly rated young players in for a player that was at his peak, entering the final stage of his career, even though Douglas Luiz is not, old by any stretch of the imagination, means that Villa have the potential to grow with both of those players over the next few years. And let's see what sort of level he can turn out. I mean, for now, with your depth in central midfield and more attacking senses, it feels like he just needs to play a backup role and maybe be happy with 10, 12 appearances next year and grow from there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the right back area as well, which is somewhere I do imagine Villa will try to strengthen at least. Where in the Villa squad as a whole, from what you can see so far, where do you think Villa might target for the rest of this transfer window?
Well, I think a lot of it's going to be tied into John Duran and whether he potentially leaves the club. I think that's gone a little bit quiet in the last few days. His potential move to Chelsea, both clubs sort of trying to have to be a little bit sensible with PSR regulations. But I'd want Ezri Konsa, to be honest, be back in the centre of defence. I think he was very solid as a right back, but I do think he's more of a difference maker at the centre of defence. Diego Carlos really picked up towards the end of the year as well. You've got Mings coming back. You've got Pau Torres. Your centre back options are really, really strong. I'd potentially look to sign someone who could rotate a little bit more with Ollie Watkins. I don't think there was a single outfield player in the Premier League that played more minutes than him last season. He was remarkably durable, and whilst you'd want him to start every game, particularly if he manages to replicate that form from 23-24, having a backup there will just help. The Champions League is expanded next year. Villa have never played in it. Of course, he played in the European Cup, but never played in the Champions League. There's 8 group games. There's a higher intensity than when you were in the Conference League last year. I think you need a more experienced forward as well to complement Duran and if he stays and Watkins as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was right back and a backup forward.
Sure thing. And Lewis Dobbin as well has also joined from Everton. Undisclosed fee. Tim Iroegbunam's gone the other way to Everton for a reported £9 million. What do you make of that deal and the various deals that seem to be going on Villa, Everton, and Chelsea? It's a bit of a firestorm, and it seems to be very much it's not really a black and white topic, really, is it? It's a difficult one.
Yeah, I mean, you need full access to their accounts to see why they are having to do these moves. I do think like a lot of these moves are very overpriced, but then it's all about balancing each other's books. They've clearly come to some sort of agreement of we need to make a loss here, we need to make a gain here. They've got 5 days until the 30th of June deadline. I wouldn't be surprised if there's even more slightly strange moves in the Premier League in the next few days. Lewis Dobbin, not a player that I thought would end up at a Champions League club this summer. Not a player that I see playing a major role for Villa next season. But then at the same time, you've signed youngsters and used them effectively in the last 6 months. Morgan Rogers, who we already sort of name checked as well. I thought his impact after joining from Middlesbrough was really, really impressive. You've seen, other players like Adam Wharton at Crystal Palace, really sort of step up at that level as well. So, I don't want to rule them out, but it feels like transfers of necessity rather than, something that Emery's been dreaming of signing Lewis Dobbin this summer.
Yeah. And just one final question as well. I saw you mentioned Ethan Ampadu, Leeds player. I'm amazed at how young he still is, actually. I think he's in his early 20s. It feels like he's been around since about the year 1998. But yeah, you mentioned him yesterday as a potential Douglas Luiz replacement, I saw. What makes you think that might be a good deal for Villa?
Yeah, I mean, this was on our show on Football Daily Sunday Vibes, and this was filmed before the Barrenechea transfer was talked about. In fairness, but I do think he's got a higher ceiling than Barrenechea, and he's further along in his development than Barrenechea too. I think Barrenechea's had 1 full season of playing for Frosinone. As you say, Ampadu was playing for Exeter City, I think, when he was 15. Then got bought by Chelsea. Barely got a look in at Chelsea, along with a lot of players of that age, and you see it continuing now with Chelsea, but has played a relegation season with Sheffield United. Didn't play at his best there by any stretch at all, but played in Italy with Spezia. He's played for Venezia. He's played for a very top championship club at Leeds. He was one of the leaders at Leeds. He was captaining them at various points last season. He can play as a centre-back, which I think is helpful. And to be fair, he played a lot of his football in the back half of last season as a centre-back, but I think he's got high potential to cover for Camera in defensive midfield as well. And given the fact they spent, I think it was £7 million on him last summer, Leeds, given the fact there's question marks over whether they need to sell this summer, having not made it back to the Premier League, I think he could be available for a cut price fee. He's only 23 years old. He's already got 50 caps for Wales. He's experienced. He's versatile. His passing numbers were really, really high in the Championship last year. And he feels like someone that's on the cusp of a real breakthrough. And for a club like Villa, who need to strengthen their depth in various positions if they want to continue to progress in the Premier League, if they want to get into the Champions League knockout, if they want to maybe have a cup run as well, they're going to need a bigger squad. They're going to need to have to rotate in certain areas. And I think Ampadu would be a good rotation option.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Dougie. That's absolutely fantastic to chat to you. Always love chatting football with you, particularly when it's about Aston Villa, of course. So for those who don't know, where can we find you and your work online?
Thank you, Frankie. Well, it's been great to jump onto the podcast once again. Yeah, at Dougie Critchley on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I tend to use Twitter, but you feel free to follow on Instagram and TikTok too. And then I work for Sky Sports' Football Daily. I also work on Sky Sports News and various Sky shows. So yeah, a little bit of everywhere. But yeah, thanks very much for having me on. Always a pleasure to chat footy with you.